All right, so in this screencast, I'm going to be recreating my old screencast, but this time with a decent microphone. And I'm going to be showing you how to configure and set up and initially bootstrap a server using Ansible. Ansible, if you don't know, is a configuration management tool. It saves you from writing millions and millions of bash shell scripts. And instead, what you do is you describe the state of your system in a set of YAML config files, and then Ansible acts on those config files and adjusts the system so that it matches what you would like it to be. It's very much more of a functional programming paradigm instead of an imperative programming paradigm, and as such it has several advantages. So as you can see here, we're on my DigitalOcean control panel. We're going to go ahead and create a droplet. So as our host name, I guess we'll just use Ansible host. And the default size is fine. San Francisco is closer to me, so we'll select that region. And then we'll just go ahead and use Ubuntu 14.04. We will add my SSH key. That just makes the process easier. And beep, beep. Normally, I would also enable the backups, but I'm not going to do that because this is a simple test. So let's go ahead and hit the big green button. And while we're waiting for that to create, as you can see here, I've just basically got an empty project folder. And so we're going to go through here and basically talk about the structure of an Ansible project, the files you need and the files that you can add and how that whole thing is structured. So we're going to start this off by talking about the inventory file. And the inventory file, there's a couple of different locations for it, but basically what it does is it tells Ansible what servers you'd like these scripts to run on. So in our case, we have just this one DigitalOcean droplet, but Ansible can be used for more than that. It can run in parallel across multiple nodes or agents, and it can run the same command. It can run different commands depending on the groups. You can classify something as like a load balancer, a web server, an API server, that sort of thing. And you can really separate that out into roles, into physical location. You have a lot of options there. But the way you pass in which inventory file to use is you type in the base command, which is Ansible playbook. You use the -i flag for inventory. And then in our case, we might use a host as the file. If we take a look at what a host file looks like, it's just a basic config file in an ini format. So you can use headers like this, server. You can put comments in, starting with a hash like that. And you can also, every line is the name of a server or the IP address of a server. So in our case, we have this server group and it doesn't have anything in it right now. But if we go back over to this, you can see it's created this Ansible host droplet. So we can go back in here and just paste that IP address in, which is 107.170.201.230. And now that is a part of this server group. So we can either address it by name, we can address it by the keyword all, which will apply these commands to everything in our host file. Again, in this case, it's just this one. Or we could apply something to just the server group, which again would apply it to this. You can also use more complex regex stuff. And if you have any questions about this, you can go to docs.ansible.com, and then it is intro inventory.html, or you could just search Ansible inventory. But as you can see here, you've got a couple of different options. You can use numeric patterns like right here. If you have similar host names, you can do that sort of thing, basically. If we go back over here, we now have a host file. We've written it. We need a playbook. Now, it's traditional to call this site.yaml, but in our case, we're going to call this bootstrap.yaml. And the reason for that is very simple, and that's that we don't necessarily want this to run every time. It's going to be doing stuff like logging in as root, and it's also going to be configuring the root account, potentially changing the password, resetting the password, that sort of stuff. And so while normally you can run any Ansible script you want pretty much any time and it will reset the machine to a known state, I'm always hesitant to run anything as root. The other thing here is that if this correctly runs, then we're going to be disabling root login, which means that this script will no longer run. So this is kind of a one-off. We're calling it bootstrap.yaml as a result of that. Now, if you're at all familiar with the YAML format, it's much like Python in that I hate it, and it's mostly white space sensitive. But basically what you can do is you can do something like this. So on all hosts, and again, we could change this to server, or we could paste in our IP address, but we're just going to do all hosts, and then we're going to do the following tasks. But we also need to make sure that we're specifying we're going to be logging in as the remote user root. And we're not going to put a remote password there, but we need to make sure we pass that into the Ansible playbook binary so that it asks us for the remote password. Or we would if we needed a remote password to log in as root. Now, you may need that on like Linode or something like that, but in DigitalOcean, if you remember, it took our SSH key. So we can log into root as it is. We don't have to worry about that. Just to prove that to you, if we open up a new tab here, remote host ID, right, because DigitalOcean has this nasty habit of reusing IP addresses. So if we go to 63, which I think was it, yeah, there we go. Yep. Okay, so you probably won't have to do that, but basically I just opened up my known host file and deleted the previous connection. SSH rightfully pointed out that the machine is not what it thought the machine was because DigitalOcean reused the IP address. So as you can see, we successfully logged in. We didn't need a password or anything, and you can see up there it says Ubuntu 14.04 LTS. So I'm going to go ahead and close that tab. So again, we don't have to put the remote password. We don't have to pass it in the command line. However, we do have a couple of tasks here. And one of the things that Ansible does that I really like is that you can name each of the tasks. And in fact, it's generally considered really good practice to make sure that you're naming these tasks. So for example, we have this task. Let's say we need to add a user account, which we probably do. And then for now, we can just leave that blank, and it will act almost as if a to-do. And then we can flesh these out later. But I think the goal here is that we want to describe the steps that are necessary to fix our system and the state we want our system to be in. And then we can add the commands to do that. But that gives us a nice high-level overview. So in our case, if we want to have a user account, we probably also want an admin group. And then we want the admin group to be in the sudoers file. The admin group. And then we probably also want the SSH key. And then in terms of SSH, what I'd like to do, and what I generally do, is configure so we want to disallow root login for SSH. And we'd also like to disallow password login for SSH. We want a pure public or PGP key system here. We don't want passwords, plain text, or otherwise being passed like that. So instead, we're just going to be relying on our public and private key pairs here. Now we have all of these. Well, you may be asking yourself, how do we actually implement them? And there's a couple of things that I'd like to point you to. The first is on the Ansible docs. If you take a look over here, in this module index, you have a list of all these modules, and a module is just a category for a set of actions. So if we go over here to the system modules, you can see there's a couple of ones here. You can manage cron files, you can manage groups, which we'll need to do. You can manage user accounts, which again we'll need to do, so that's good. And then we also want to manage our SSH keys. So I've opened those tabs, so let's take a look here. So this is the structure of a help file for a specific action. Now, at the top here, it's got this group, add or remove groups, along with the author, and a synopsis, options, and examples. So the synopsis gives a brief description of what the action does. In this case, it manages the presence of groups on a host. Pretty self-explanatory. The options that you can pass in here are a group ID, a name, a state, and a system. Of those, only the name is required, although generally when a state is an optional parameter, it's considered good practice to pass that in because it makes your intent very clear. The other really cool thing down here is that it's got a list of examples. In this specific action, you don't have to worry about it too much. It's pretty self-explanatory, and in fact, we're going to be following this exact format. But for other actions like the user or authorized key action, the examples will be very helpful. So if we go back to our editor, now I'm going to move this one up here because we want to add an admin group first, so then we can, or more accurately, we want to verify that there is an admin group first and create it if there is not. And then we want to make sure that the user account not only exists, but is also a part of that admin group. So if we make sure the admin group exists first, we won't run into any race condition errors there. So the name of the action was group, and we want name equals admin because we're creating the admin group. And we want the state to be present, which means that created if it's not there. The alternative to state being present is, absent, and what that does is just remove it if it is there. But again, in our case, we just want to create the admin group, so that's nice and easy. Now over here we also want to create a user account, so let's go over to the help page for a user account. As you can see, there's quite a few more options here, but luckily there's just a few that actually matter to us. The first one is name up here, which again, you can see the second column here is required, and name is the only required one. Just like in the groups action, we also have this state parameter that can be passed in, and again, the options are present and absent. We can also select the shell, which would be good to do because we want to make sure we're being explicit for that. And while there is a password option here, the trouble is it does require a pre-crypted value. That's not really something that I'm interested in going into in this screencast. We can do it later. I actually prefer to have my my server setups for passwordless access via SSH, and then when I'm there, I can run the password command. That keeps passwords out of the text files used in Ansible, and make sure that they are kept solely in my memory or in a password manager like 1Password. So again, there's quite a few options here, but the only ones that it looks like we need are name, group, or groups in this case, because we want the main group to be the username, and then we also want groups. I know up here there's append, which will add the groups instead of setting them, so in case we want to ever add more groups, we can do it non-destructively. And so there's shell, there's name, there's groups, and there's state, because we like being explicit and specifying that. So, so if we go over here, we can do user, and I'm going to start this off with a greater than sign, because that means that you can spread the action out over multiple lines. It's a YAML thing, and that helps me keep a mental picture of what's actually going on. So I'm just going to set it to my name, but obviously, like if you're running this yourself, you're going to change that. Another better solution would be to keep this in a variable file, but that's kind of outside of the scope for this initial screencast. So we want to make sure that I'm present, and we also want to make sure that the groups that I'm in include at least admin. And let's just append that just in case. And then the only other thing is, in terms of shell, we want bin bash. All right, that all seems to make sense, and that seems good. So let's go to the next one. Now, this is a little bit more complicated. We want to make sure that the admin group is in the sudoers file. So what that means is that the admin group should have access to sudo. So for that, what we're going to do is we're going to use the files module, and we're going to use the line in file action. This basically, well, as you can read up here, it ensures a particular line is in a file, or it replaces an existing line using a back reference regex. If you scroll down to the bottom, though, there's a couple of examples, and this goes back to what I was saying before, which is the examples are really helpful. Specifically, this last one is actually really useful. So this says line in file, the destination is etc. sudoers, the state is present, and the regex is admin all. The line, if the regex doesn't match, so the line to fill in is admin all, no password all. And then we want to validate that by running the sudo cf%s. Basically, what that whole thing means is check this etc. sudoers file for this regex. If it doesn't match, put this line in, and then validate the whole thing using this command. So that's almost exactly what we want, even down to the admin group name. So let's go over here and just paste that in. Now, it is kind of a long one, so I'm going to go ahead and separate that out, just like we did before, into a couple of lines, and then we're going to fix the indentation, because Vim seems to mess that up a little. Okay, so we have the destination, the state, the regex, the line, validate. Everything seems to make sense here, and again, if you note, the admin group matches what we called the group over here and what we called the group here. Somebody who's more experienced here might add in a variable for this, for the admin group. You may not. It depends how normalized you want this. But for now, I think this is just perfect. So let's go over to making sure our user account has our public SSH key, which I misspelled, which is embarrassing. So there we go. I know everyone's been whining at me the whole time. Okay, let's go to authorized key. So this is the action. It adds or removes an SSH authorized key. Super simple. So what we need here is, again, to just look at these authorized key examples. So if we grab this, because this looks pretty much perfect for us, we can paste that in. And again, we're going to split this over multiple lines, just like we did before. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about this. For the user, so this reads, for the user Kieran D, the key should be, and then it looks up this file on our local system, so my home directory.ssh, idrsa.pub, so my public key, and then lookup is Python, and basically all it does is it grabs that and chucks it in the string. We then pass that string into the key parameter for this. As you can see, Vim kind of breaks the syntax highlighting on this, which is a little embarrassing, but I think it's a mixture of YAML and Jinja templates, pardon me. So, I mean, I'm sure there's a Vim plugin that will fix that, or you could switch to Emacs or something. Okay, so that seems like that will work for us. Next, we want to disallow root login for SSH. And instead of going over the tedium for this whole thing, I'm just going to pull up what I used before, which is down here. And this actually reminds me of one, which is important because that would be embarrassing. We want to install the OpenSSH server because Ubuntu doesn't include it by default. It includes some other implementation or like a light version or something. But basically, it doesn't give you access to the SSH service, which means that you can't easily restart it through Ansible without running a shell command, which is generally something that you want to avoid. So there's not usually a lot of cases like this where you have OS-specific stuff. But in this case, because we are running on Ubuntu, because Ubuntu doesn't include OpenSSH server, what we're doing here is we're saying apt name equals OpenSSH server, and just make sure that it's present. So as you'd expect, if we already have that and we run this script, it won't install it again. It won't try to. It knows that it's got it, and it will just skip that. As for disallowing the root access, I'm actually just going to copy this whole thing over just because that's easier, and then we'll go over and talk about it. So what this does is it says, and actually it's not even disallow unsafe SSH practices is a better title for that. So line in file, like we have up there on line 17 with the sudoers, but this time we're taking a look at the sshd config file, and the regexp is whatever we get passed in under the regexp key for the hash, and the line is, again, the line key for the hash, and just make sure that state is present. So very similar to what we did up there with the admin group and the sudoers. But this introduces us to two brand new concepts. The first is we have this notify line on 37. And what that does is it notifies Ansible that we're going to have a handler that restarts SSHD. And every time we make a change here, if we make a change, we need to make sure that handler fires at the end of this script. As you can see over here on the right, which is the full complete version, we have a handler's key for our hash, our dictionary up here. So we have handlers, and that's an array, and we have this name restart SSHD, which again corresponds to up here on the line 37, restart SSHD. And then it just calls the service action. The name is SSH, which is the service under Ubuntu, and we would just want to make sure it's restarted. The key thing to remember here is this handler only gets fired if this action above it on line 31 through 41, the one that I have highlighted here, actually changes anything. If it doesn't change anything, this handler will not get fired. We won't restart SSHD, which is another really cool thing about Ansible. The second thing that this introduces us to is this with items option. Basically, it's a simple for loop, and it just iterates over this array of hashes. So we have this, each of these hashes has two keys. The first is a regex, and the second is a line. So the regex just says, if this matches, replace, or if this does not match, put this line into the SSHD file. If it does match, then we don't change anything and we skip to the next one. So this iterates 3 times, and again, if anything changes, it notifies us to restart SSHD. Looking over on the right, it looks like we've got everything else handled. We're setting the remote user, we're making sure that we're present. Cool. All right, so since everything works there, I'm gonna go ahead and close that. And we've saved that, and then if we take a look, so we've just got these 2 files, and we run Ansible playbook, and remember we use the -i flag, and we're just going to choose the host file, which just contains our new server's IP address, and then the only other flag here is we want to send it to bootstrap.yaml, which is the file we were just working on. So if we run that, it shows us some cows say cows, which is great. You can disable that if you change the environment variable Ansible no cows, I think it is. Now, as you can see through here, we went ahead and changed a couple of things. Let's see if we can scroll through in order. So we start the play up here. We're gathering facts, and what that means is Ansible is retrieving information about the systems that it's checking. In our case, again, we're only checking one system. So it says on this host, which is this IP address, everything went well, gathering the facts. We're adding an admin group next, and again it says changed here, which means that the admin group didn't exist before and it's adding it. Same for the user account. We need to make sure the admin group is in the sudoers file, which again it did. We need to make sure our account has our public SSH key. We need to install the OpenSSH server because of Ubuntu, and it looks like that actually didn't have to do anything, which is great. So maybe the latest version of Ubuntu has it, maybe I was incorrect. Either way, we didn't actually have to adjust that, which is fantastic. If we go over to disallow unsafe SSH practices right here, it looks like we changed all 3. And then we had to notify to restart SSHD, which did. So down here you have a summary or a play recap, and you have you have a line, right, which the first part of the line indicates the host, and then it says okay 8. So we ran 8 tasks, all 8 of them were okay, and 6 of them resulted in changes. The interesting thing here though is that if I run it again, it's not going to work because we can't connect because we've disabled root access. So that goes back to what I was talking about in the beginning of the screencast, which is this is kind of a one-off script. You usually won't write stuff like this where you can't run it more than once. If we did write something like that, if we ended up running that, as you'd expect, it would go through and it would say, okay, 8 changed 0. Or maybe even okay, 7 changed 0 because it wouldn't have to fire the handler. But we can go ahead and test to make sure our changes worked. So our user account, and then actually I've forgotten the, okay, cool. So, nope. All right, so right here I'm connecting to the server using my user account. This didn't work before because I didn't have a user account on the server, and it now does work. So I'm able to connect. I'm able to connect passwordless. Root is no longer able to connect. I can do stuff like change to root, I think. Maybe not. There was a way to do that. I don't remember how. Oh, yes. Right. So we can't change to root because root doesn't have a password. But what we can do is we can use sudo to change anything. So if I really wanted to, I'm not going to do it on the screencast, but I could type sudo password, and I could change the password for this account, or I could change the password for root and thereby enable su. We're not going to do that though. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at our config file, our SSH config file, and just make sure that that worked. So as you can see here, here's 2 of the 3 lines that we indicated at the bottom. We have the password authentication no and GSS API authentication no. So both of those are disallowed as per our Ansible rule. We also had a root login. Root. Oh, yes. There it is. This is not my Vim. But we've got permit root login no. So basically, all our changes worked. We're through, and we've bootstrapped a server with some safe SSH defaults, a default user account, passwordless login via SSH keys, and we've also gone through some of the basics of Ansible, including installing software via the apt key, the apt action here. We've handled the line-in file, doing regex with items, and some basics for handlers. I think I'm going to follow this up with some more details, maybe installing something like Docker or a web server and managing that via Ansible. But I think for now we've got the basics covered. We'll need to talk about playbooks in the future and some other stuff. But again, this will all be available on GitHub, and actually is available on GitHub right now. It is on my user account. So if you go to github.com, it's one of these. I can promise you that. Yeah, here we are. It's kieran.d/bootstrapping with Ansible. I'll throw a link in the description. But basically, it's got this bootstrap.yaml file. It's got all the stuff that we talked about. It also has a simple make file. All right, guys, so I think that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on GitHub, on app.net, or even on email, YouTube, whatever your preferred method of communication is. Have a good one.